Welcome on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I am an educator at the museum. This afternoon, you have the honor and privilege of listening to David Lenga, a Holocaust survivor from Poland who will share his story with you. Before we begin, I would like to share a few quick words about the museum. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure that the world would always remember and learn from this tragic history. In the early 1960s, the Holocaust had only ended about 15 years earlier, and most survivors were not yet willing to relive their trauma, largely because most people were not yet ready to listen to it. Thanks to the courage and foresight of this group of survivors, we have what became the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States, always with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. We can't do the work that we do today without our survivor community who still on a regular basis shares their experiences with us and with you to be able to teach you firsthand what they experienced. Today is also a special day. January 27th is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which since 2005 has been a day that the United Nations called for to implement Holocaust education programming in schools to prevent further acts of genocide, rejection of Holocaust denial and distortion, and condemnation of religious intolerance of any kind. January 27th was chosen for International Holocaust Remembrance Day because it's the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest death camp in which over 1 million Jews perished. This camp stands as an infamous symbol for the atrocities of the Holocaust. Today, around the world, we honor the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust, as well as other ethnic and religious groups who fell victim to Nazism and their ideology. This afternoon, you have the honor and privilege of listening to David Lenga, a treasured member of our community who speaks on such a regular basis to educate the world. David, we are so honored to have you with us today. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us and for being with us today.
Thank you so very much. I'm honored to appear before you, and I am honored also to remember all these millions that perished, including 98 members of my own family. I would like to share with you today my own story, the story of survival, of trauma, and of hope. And let me start by saying that I was not born into the Holocaust. I was born in the city of Lodz, Poland, in 1927. I was born into a Jewish religious family. My parents were quite well-to-do. My father was a manufacturer. He had a tannery in this little city of Strykow, north of the city of Lodz. And so I knew the good life. I had a younger brother. He was 4 years younger than myself, by the name of Nathan. And the two of us, and my father and mother, consisted of our immediate family. As I was growing older, obviously I became bilingual because I had to learn the Polish language. My first language was Yiddish because this is what my parents and everyone else around me was talking to me. So I grew up with two languages. But by the time I was ready to go out and play in the sandbox, maybe with other children, obviously most of the children around me were not Jewish, because we lived in a majority Christian society. It was Catholic Christian predominantly. And so we had a lot of Christian friends. And so when we were playing in the sandbox or wherever, we were getting along just fine as children do. And there was no problem. We were laughing together. We were cajoling together. We were creating antics, whatever it was that we were doing together. But if I ever happened to have said or done something that mispleased those non-Christian children, they were spewing forth a venom, an anti-Semitic venom that was evidently inherent in society. They accused me at this tender age of being a scabby Jew. In Polish, parszywy Żydzie. And when they said that to me, I started crying. I ran back home to my mom and I asked her, Mom, am I scabby? And my mom says, no, honey, you are not scabby. You are a wonderful, pure, beautiful boy, and I love you. I'm proud of you. That was my first encounter with anti-Semitism outside of my own home. And I had to live in this society. But we learned how to get along because we had to. Jews lived in Poland for over thousands of years. And so consequently, I grew up having mostly Jewish friends. I was going to Cheder after public school. And I was thriving in my own way within the atmosphere in which I surrounded myself with. So this was a wonderful life. We went on vacations. My father could afford it. We went to the countryside in the summertime. We had a wonderful life. I had a good childhood, a wonderful childhood, myself and my brother. And so one day, one fateful day, on September the 1st, 1939, I find myself on a streetcar in the city of Lodz, Poland, going on an errand for my mom. And within 15 minutes of that ride, at that particular time, the sirens of the city came on blaring something alarmingly. Everything stopped in its tracks, and people started running for cover. And I didn't know what was happening. Nobody else seemed to be having a clear understanding what was going on. But the adults knew that some danger is lurking since the sirens are blaring. So everybody was running in different directions to look for shelter, evidently. And I did too. But before we had a chance to get out of the streetcar, an armada of German attack planes descended upon the civilian population and were machine gunning everything in sight. And within minutes, I witnessed at 11 years of age, a river of blood in front of me, body parts flying, people screaming, so many dead, falling on all sides. And I looked for shelter in a courtyard nearby as I was running. And this lasted for about a half an hour, it seems like, because a tremendous devastation was created then. And people were bewildered and nobody had any answers. Nobody could understand what they just witnessed. Neither could I. I found my way home and the streets were deserted in the middle of the day. I came home and my dad pulled me in and he said, what did you see? And I told him, and he sat us down, myself, my brother, my mom. He became very somber. And he said to us in no uncertain terms, he said, I need you to understand that what we have witnessed today was the beginning of the darkest time in Jewish history. We don't know what tomorrow brings. We don't know what the next moment is going to look like, but we have to stick together. And that is exactly what happened. And so within days, there was a tremendous hunger setting in because the farmers did not want to sell, neither did the retail stores, because the money was worthless right after the attack. And that was the beginning of World War II. Hitler created a blitzkrieg on Poland. He vanquished them within 2 weeks, marched in with his massive troops, occupied the city and the country. And I've witnessed unbelievable scenes where the civilian population was standing on the sidewalks. Some of them were forced to stand there and watch the German army occupy the city. And as they were coming in, heavily armed, I witnessed people that I knew. Many of them were supposedly our neighbors, our teachers, our students that we were together with, people that we knew a lifetime. They stood on the sidewalk, so many of them, with swastika armbands already on their arms, prepared. And the women were greeting the incoming troops with flowers. These were Polish women. I couldn't understand the scene. So I told to my dad, I said, Dad, what they're doing is treachery. This is treason. They're welcoming the enemy. And my dad shut me up very quickly and he says, you must not talk, just keep it for yourself. We witnessed that scene. We went home. We mulled over what we just saw, and it was horrendous. We didn't have good answers. So within 3 days of what is happening, a Jeep comes up to the front of our home, a German Jeep with 3 soldiers with machine guns. One of them knocks frantically on our door. I saw this through the kitchen window. My brother did too, and so did my mom. We became absolutely petrified. We didn't know why they chose us. What did they want from us particularly? But my dad spoke a very good German, so he said to my mom, Sarah, just be calm. Let me go see what they want. He opens the door and he says in German to the soldier, Jawohl, was kann ich für Sie tun? Okay, what can I do for you? And he said, are you Abraham Lenga? And he said, yes, I am. You come with us right now, without any question, just as you are, right now. My dad didn't know how to react, so he turned to my mom and he said, Sarah, I'll be back as soon as I can. They took him away to the German Gestapo headquarters. Gestapo is the equivalent to the FBI. They interrogated him there, and they told him in no uncertain terms that we know that you are the owner of the factory in Strykow on the tannery, and we are here to tell you that as of this moment, you are no longer the owner of that factory. This factory is being confiscated by the Third Reich, the German government, and you are ordered hereby to work for the German government and produce leather and fur and clothing. We will supply you the raw materials. You supply the labor from among the Jews of the city of Strykow. And that's an order. They sent them home, and within 3 days, a truck came, loaded us up, myself, my mom and brother, and my grandma that was living with us. And we were transported to the 18 kilometers north of the city to the city of Strykow. And the city of Strykow was a small agricultural town, basically, but like 30 or 40% of the population were Jewish. Amazing. And so we knew that city well, and we were assigned a place where to live. What they did is they emptied out a house that used to belong to someone, and they ensconced us in that house. This is where we're going to stay, and this is where we're going to work. And then within no time at all, they announced that there is a perimeter created in this town within which the Jews may live and work, and they may not go out of this perimeter. In effect, what they did, they created a ghetto. We understood the severity of the edict, and we had no choice but to abide. My dad realized that if you work and you're employed gainfully by the German government, you have a chance of survival. If you do not, you may not survive because you'll be considered as dead wood. They have no use for you. They kill you. So he went to the commander and he requisitioned 50% more labor than he actually needed to save the Jews of Strykow. to the extent that he could do it. So he got this 50% more than what he needed, and he employed them in the factory. We were toiling in this factory and producing leather, fur, and clothing for the German army for 2 years. It was a horrendous experience because there was no hospital. We were deprived of everything. We were deprived of all human rights. We were deprived of any rights at all. We had no rights. So we could not go to school. We could not get out of the perimeter of the ghetto. We could not do anything other than what we are ordered to do. And so everybody had to work by self, and my dad and my mom had to work. My brother was too young, he was 4 years younger than me, so he stayed home with my grandma. And this is how this was going on for 2 long years to 1942. In 1942, the Germans realized that they need to consolidate their labor force. So they eliminated all the small town ghettos, including Strykow, and they selected able-bodied men and women and threw them into the larger ghettos of Lodz and Warsaw and others that were already established by 1942. They were fully established with barbed wire, with high fences, with guards, towers, and guard dogs, and reflectors, and it was a hermetically closed prison, the Lodz Ghetto. So they made a selection in the city of Strykow by telling the Jews that they have to report to the Jewish cemetery, and the ghetto is being eliminated. And so we had to report there, and we sat there for 3 days and 3 nights. No food, no water, no means of alleviating oneself. It was hell on earth. It was terrible. Some people even died. After 3 days, they came with trucks, with soldiers, with machine guns, with dogs, and they made selections. We stood in lines, and they selected those that are able-bodied, what they consider able-bodied, and those that are not. So the ones that are able-bodied with the sign of the thumb to the right or to the left meant death or life or death. And so if you go to the right, you go to work to other ghetto, to the Lodz Ghetto, and if you go to the left, you get killed. I didn't know, neither did anyone know the ramifications of this, because we were kept in the dark. We had no access to news of any kind. We were completely in the dark of what's happening around us. So my mom, myself, my brother, and my grandma, we were told to go to the ghetto in Lodz, and my dad was taken away. He was very sick at that time, by the way. He had double pneumonia. He had no treatment of any kind. He had high fever. And when they selected him to go to the left, along with other men, to be taken to slave labor or whatever, my mom said to me at that time when we witnessed this, David, she said, your dad is not going to survive the day. He is that sick. And so once I lost my dad and they took him away, I took it for granted that my dad is not alive. In the ghetto, we were thrown in and we were assigned a place where to live, along with some other families in a very cramped quarters. And we were assigned eventually places where to work. Everybody had to be employed. And so I was employed to work in a clothing factory. My mother went to my uncle that was the head of the factory, and she pleaded with him. She says, Charlie, his name was Giel in Yiddish. He says, I want you to take care of my boy. He is now deprived of any education. He cannot go to school. He cannot, what's going to happen to him? How is he growing up? He needs to have at least a trade or something to be able to stand on his own feet eventually. So take him under your wing, teach him a trade. So he taught me within 2 years in the ghetto, he taught me how to become a tailor, because this was an actually very active and productive manufacturing plant that they created. They converted the biggest hospital in the city of Lodz into a clothing manufacturing and employed hundreds and hundreds of people there, and I was among them. Within 2 years, I was a full-fledged tailor. What happened in the ghetto is indescribable, because the Germans implemented their nefarious plans of getting rid of the Jews, of killing them in any means that they could think of. Hunger was the preferred weapon. And so there was constant hunger in the ghetto. We were always malnourished, undernourished, never given enough food. And everybody was hungry and starving. And so did I. And in 1942, that same year that we were thrown into the ghetto from Strykow, about 6 or 7 months later, in the fall, they made a tremendous raid on the ghetto. And they made selections, again, the able-bodies from the not able-bodied. They were sifting through the population. And I remember that all of us had to stand in long lines outside of our homes. And these German officers in front of each line were making the selections with their thumb, left or right. And I saw my mom standing in front of me. And she was told to go to the right, back to work, because at that time, in 1942, my mom was only 41 years old. Of course, she was able-bodied. So she was told to go back to work. I, my brother, my grandma, and all the people behind me, evidently, they were all told to go to the left to die. And we were selected to be eliminated. And we wound up in a warehouse outside of the city. And in this warehouse, with all these many people milling around, I found myself with my brother, bewildered, alone, sitting and waiting for something to happen, like everyone else did. What happened in the interim that was unbeknownst to me at that time was that my mom, once she went back to the ghetto, she went straight to my uncle and pleaded with him to do something, to pull some strings, to talk to some important people, he knows so many, to save her children. I want my children back, she said to him. And he said to her, Sarah, what makes you believe that I am a different Jew than anyone else in the ghetto? I have no power. They're using me for their own purposes. But I have no power. I cannot tell them what to do. I cannot even ask them what to do, because no one is listening to me. I'm just another Jew. I'm sorry, Sarah, he said to her. I cannot help you. And so she went back very heartbroken, and she reported back to the line, just like she told her sister that she would do. And she says, take me to where my children are. Whatever happens to them will happen to me. And they were more than happy to oblige, and they took her away, and I never saw my mom again. I was 14 years of age. When I was told in this warehouse, oh yeah, so when my mom, after she spoke to my uncle, something must have happened in between, because in that warehouse, sitting there with my brother, I hear all of a sudden my name called. And I didn't understand, of all the people, why me? So I said to my brother, did you hear my name called? And he says, yes, absolutely. So I go to the front door to see what they want, and this burly looking, very menacing man looks at me approaching, and he says, are you David Lenga? And I says, yes, I am. He says, he opens the door a crack, and he says to me, get the hell out of here. Run for your life. Run back to the ghetto. Don't look back. Just run. And I said, but I have my brother here. I want him with me. Never mind your brother. We'll take care of him. And so I ran back to the ghetto. The first thing I did, I was looking for my mom, where I lived. And my mom was nowhere to be found. My aunt was there, her older sister. I said, Aunt Bina, where is mom? She knew. She wouldn't tell me. She saw I was very distressed. So she says, calm down. Maybe she went to look for you. It took me a while, waiting and waiting, and my mom did not show up. And then I just really got angry with my aunt, and I said, you have to level with me. What happened to my mom? Why isn't she here? And she had told me the truth. And at that point, at the age of 14, I realized for the first time in my life that I'm all alone. I was a total orphan. I lost my father, my mother now, my brother, all the people that I loved or loved me were gone from my life. And I'm all alone in the ghetto. Life wasn't worth living. I became suicidal. And the third day after this happened, I found my way to an attic in an abandoned building, not far away from where I lived. I tried to pry open the window of the attic and throw myself down and end my life because life had no meaning. But my aunt was after me like an eagle. She was watching me. She saw that I can be dangerous to myself. She pulled me back by the scruff of my neck and she says, I'm not going to let you do it. If you lose hope, you have lost everything. There's nothing else left. So we have to be hopeful that tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday. You're going to be staying with us, and the three of us, we're going to somehow make it work for us. We will make it from day to day and try the best we can and hope for a better tomorrow. And what happened was that in the ghetto, every single person, if he wanted to eat, even getting small rations, you need to work. If you don't work, you don't get coupons, you don't get rations, and you cannot eat. And everybody was already starving. So I had to go to work every single day, long hours. And that proved to be a therapy for me in a way, because it helped me not to think about what just happened. The days and the months went by, and I was working, and I was starving, and I was hungry. And one day, the rumor spread in the ghetto that new arrivals came from all around Europe, Jews thrown out from other ghettos into the ghetto in Lodz. They were able-bodied men and women. And they came from every corner of Europe that Germany occupied. And so when that happens, when this news spread, everybody that was in the ghetto, the resident, was going to the place to see if they can recognize anybody from among those newcomers. So did I. I looked and looked, but I couldn't find anyone that I could recognize. And so disheartened, I turned back going home. And as I was going back, I heard my name called from within the fenced area. David, don't go. Come back. I want to talk to you. I didn't know who it was. I turned around. There was a youngish looking man, but I didn't know who he was. So I says, do you know me? He says, of course I know you. I know your brother, and I know your whole family, your father, mother. I'm the friend of your parents. I didn't know that. And I said, really? I said, so do you have any news for me? He says, yes. I was working with your dad about 3 weeks ago in the Poznan concentration camp. Oh my God, I figured, is that correct? But really? Yes, really. And he's doing okay. He had 3 broken ribs, but he recovered, but he's okay. And he's working. And when I heard that, it was like an infusion of new hope in my soul. My God, my dad is alive. Now I have somebody to live for. It really gave me an impetus. It gave me a reason to struggle and to wait for the time when maybe one day, when I'm free, maybe my dad will survive as well. And so this is what I did. I lived with my hope. But what I witnessed in the ghetto was horror to an unimaginable extent for a normal human being. What we witnessed was children with swollen bellies dying on the sidewalk of the street. What we witnessed were people depriving their own children, if they had any, of the ration of food so they could save their own self. What we witnessed was disease and hunger and skeletons, naked dead bodies thrown on lorries, piled high, drawn on the cart, not by horses, but by men outside of the ghetto where they were digging fresh graves, mass graves, to dump those bodies in and burn them. And no one knew what happens to these souls. no trace. This is what I witnessed on a daily basis. And I had to live in this atmosphere like everyone else. For 2 years, till 1944, we were toiling and dying and being sick and suffering in this environment. In 1944, unbeknownst to us, the Germans suffered tremendous losses on the Russian front, and the Allies from the south and the Russians from the east were coming towards Germany with great numbers. The Allies already entered Europe at Dunkirk. So the Germans felt the great pressure on them, and they decided to eliminate the ghettos in Poland. Among them was the ghetto of Lodz. They announced with placards plastered all over the city that on this and this day, the ghetto is being dissolved, eliminated, and all the men and women have to report to the substation of Marishin. That was a train substation. And from there, they will be transported to Germany proper. And there in Germany, they were promised to be getting gainful work and better food conditions. And so people had no choice, because that was under penalty of death, unless you report to the train station and they find you not complying, they shoot you on the spot. So people were lining up day in and day out, region after region, street after street, and they were reported by the thousands to that station to be deported. I could hear in 1944 in the ghetto, I could hear the reverberations of the cannons. That's how close the front was. The Russians were that close. They were already on the eastern seaboard of the Vistula River in Warsaw. They were coming ever closer to the city of Lodz. I could hear the reverberations of the explosions. That's how close the front was. And I said to myself, I'm not going to be evacuated to Germany. I'm going to hide out. If I can hide out for a day or two, maybe a week, I can be liberated by the Russians and be a free man. And I took it upon myself to do this. I was about 17 years old at that time. But my aunt and my cousin, her son, that were willing to be evacuated, told me that I'm taking my life in my own hands if I do this, and I have no hope of survival this way. I knew the danger, but I took a chance. And so everybody left within days. The ghetto was emptied of Jews, and I found myself alone. Or at least that's what I understood to be alone, because I could see no one else around. But I couldn't show my face. I was in hiding. I was thinking, what happens if I'm discovered? So I went to an abandoned building about 3 houses away from where I lived, up to the upper attic, and I was looking for a hiding place. And on that attic, smelly and mildewy and old, the roof, the rafters were covered with planks. I pulled one of those planks away, and between the rafter and the plank, there was a hollow. I fit myself in that hollow because I was pretty emaciated, pretty small, and I could fit in there. And I decided that this is going to be my hiding place in case I need it. And so now I had a hiding place. I was scavenging at night to get some food. And I was lucky. I found different scraps of food that sustained me. But one day I found a whole potato. That was my undoing almost, because I was so happy about it. It's going to save my life for a while. And I tried to cook it the next day, and I made a big mistake, because in the ghetto, we didn't have gas or we didn't have electricity. So we had to cook by splinters, by wood. And the wood, once it burns, it shows the black smoke coming out from the chimney. And the Germans noticed that. And they were descending upon me with screams and yells. And the dogs start barking. And I realized that I'm discovered. My existence is discovered. I ran for my life to my hiding place. I left everything on the stove. And I was waiting breathlessly what would happen next. What happens was they came ever closer and they were almost on the second floor when a miracle happened. The sirens of the city came on. Don't forget the front was closed. And that means a standing order by the German army that if the sirens come on, you leave everything as it is in its tracks and you run for cover. And they did. They ran to the bunkers and they left me alone. And I was in that hole for till late at night. I didn't dare to get out. By the time I came out, I was despondent. Already a week passed by. The reverberations did not happen anymore. The Russians stopped in their tracks. They didn't go any further. I was not liberated. And I was despondent, didn't know what to do. I looked out the next day through the kitchen window in total despair. And I see an incredible sight. I see white men dressed in white in front of my window walking past with brooms in their hands. And I couldn't understand what I was looking at. So I was daring to sneak out and to pull this last man by the coat and ask him, what are you doing? Who are you? What is happening here? He says, we're the White Guard. And I said, what's the White Guard? He says, well, we are a contingent of Jews that the Germans left behind to clean up the ghetto with brooms so that whoever comes in next should not see the mayhem that they created. And as a flash in my brain, I said to myself, this is my chance to get out of my despair. I said, give me a broom, I'll be one of you. We'll sweep together. They gave me the broom and I became one of the crew. And we swept for 2 days the ghetto this way. After 2 days, we were gathered together and we were put on cattle cars and we were taking what they told us is going to be Germany proper. For days on end, we were sitting in this cattle car like sardines, without food or water, without a means to eliminate. And after so many days, finally the car came to a stop. The doors flung open. And what I saw on the tarmac was frightening to no end. There were milling hundreds, it seemed like soldiers, German soldiers with machine guns, with dogs. And on the other end of the tarmac, there was a whole contingent of prisoners with striped clothing. And they chased us out from these cattle cars, screaming, raus, Juden, raus, raus. And they were beating us with the bayonets. When I came out, I was bewildered. I thought I was in Germany because that's what they said that I'm going to go to. So I said to the man next to me, the one that was the striped clothing, the prisoner, I said, excuse me, but am I in Germany? He says, no, you're not. You're in Auschwitz. And I didn't know what Auschwitz was. I had no idea, never heard that word before. And he says, yeah, you're in Auschwitz, all right. I says, what's Auschwitz? He says, turn around. So I did. So he says, see that big chimney coming up in the air and with the black smoke coming out of it? I says, yeah, I see it. So what? He says, this is where you wind up, in the black smoke. I thought this man was out of his mind. Who talks like that? What kind of a talk is this? What do you mean I'm going to wind up? Why would I wind up there? Believe me, he said, this is what's going to happen. You're going to wind up there. Before I knew what was going on, we were rounded up. We were taken and thrown into the camp itself. And in the camp in Auschwitz, we were assigned barracks. And those barracks were horrendous because people were squeezed in little cubicles where they're going to sleep, where they're going to live, where they're going to be. It is inhuman what they did to us. They deloused us. They gave us new striped clothing, ill-fitting shoes that they took from other dead people that they killed. And now we have become prisoners like everyone else. I couldn't sleep the first few nights because the sirens were blaring constantly, day and night, like 27, 27. I mean, I couldn't understand what is going on. So I said to to the men that were before me, why are these sirens blaring like this? And they said, they're making constant selection on the camp. They're taking people that they consider not able-bodied anymore, and they burning them in the crematorium. And I was like, wait a minute, do they have a list that they go by? How do they know whom to take? No, everything is very random. It's random. Well, if it's random, then I'm next. Folks, I would not want to stay in that place for 1 minute longer if I could, because I was looking for a way out. But Auschwitz was a hermetically closed prison. You couldn't get out. Even the wires were electrified. You touch it, you die. Now what do? I'm 70 years old. I'm despondent. I'm milling around the next day on the courtyard, and I saw a long line of men. So I approached the one, the last one in the line, and I says, why are you standing here, for food? He says, no, we are here to be selected as workers to go to Germany proper to work. They're looking for people in the building trade. Well, I was none of those because I was a tailor. They didn't need me. But I wanted to get out of this horrendous hellhole in the worst way. So I joined the ranks and I stood in the line. I figured I'm going to lie. The man in front of that line was nobody other than Joseph Mengele. I didn't know it at that time. He was the angel of death. He was making the selections. And as the line moved forward, I could hear all the men that were much older than me in front of me saying, I'm a carpenter, I'm a welder, I'm a bricklayer, I'm anything in the building trade. And they were taken to go to Germany. But when my turn came, he looked at me and he laughed straight in my face and he says, what the hell are you doing here? You're a kid. You still got your mother's milk on your lips. Get the hell out of here. I said, sir, I'm a carpenter. I says, like hell you are. Get out of here, and throw me out of the line. And I tried one more time to do this, and he recognized me, threw me out of the line again. He told me, if I see you one more time, I'll kill you. I knew my options out. So the next day, when all the selections were made, and I'm milling around in the courtyard, I see two burly, heavy-looking men with a heavy pole on their shoulder, with a bucket suspended in the middle, walking through the courtyard. And I go up to these guys, and I said, excuse me, but what are you doing? What is going on here? Where are you going? And he said, we are taking the soup from the kitchen to the men that were selected. And the minute they told me this, it's like a flashlight through my brain. I figured this is my chance. I put my shoulder underneath that pole in front of this guy, and I says, we're going to be the three of us taken in the soup to the holding area. He was gritting his teeth. He was screaming and yelling at me that I cannot do this. And I said, if you scream or you bring attention to yourself, we'll all be in trouble. So be quiet and let me walk. And he was intimidated, and he let me walk, and we walked into the holding area. The minute the soup was put down, I disappeared among the 200 men that were selected. I just totally disappeared. We stayed there for several hours until the people had their food. Then the trains did come, the cattle cars, and they were loading up the prisoners. And I was the very first one on that train, didn't take any chance. When the 200 men was counted, they were counting heads. The doors closed. I found myself inside the car with all the men. And I could hear screams on the outside by a man that yelled, but I was selected, I was selected. Well, I took his place. Folks, I had no compassion. I had no compassion. I had no feeling of regret. I had no feeling of guilt that I did this, because what I did is saving my life, getting out of Auschwitz surreptitiously, illegally, but I did that. The humanity we were bereft of it. It was taken away from us. The treatment that we received during those years of horror, the hunger, the starvation, the deprivation, the killing, made us into robots, made us into less than human. They took away all the feelings from us. That is the state in which we found ourselves, all of us. survivors. And so I found myself on that streetcar, on that cattle car. And for days on end, we were traveling throughout the occupied Europe. And we wound up finally in Germany, in the southern part of Germany, Bavaria. When the doors opened up and the people were thrown out from the train, from the cattle cars, we saw nothing but fields in front of us. There was no tarmac, there was no station, just fields as far as the eye went. But there were a lot of soldiers and prisoners as well. We were rounded up and we were taken to the infamous concentration camp of Dachau. In Dachau, I was registered like everybody else, deloused, given new clothing, striped clothing, ill-fitting shoes again. And I had to sign a form to fill it out and sign it by the penalty of death, that if I don't tell the truth, they'll kill me. And so I made myself older in this form, in this registration form, 2 years older than I actually was, because I figured if I am older, I may be considered more able-bodied and have a greater chance of survival. That's how street smart I was already at that age. And so I handed in this form, and many, many years later, after the war, Michael Morgenstern from the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, a researcher, found in the archives that very form that I was registered in. Unbelievable. At any rate, in Dachau, we stayed a short time. We were assigned some backbreaking work for the time we were there, and then we were assigned to sub-camps that were satellite camps of Dachau. One of them was Kaufering. I was selected to go to Kaufering. Kaufering was a labor camp, was a horrendous labor camp. People were deprived of food. They were deprived of medical attention of any kind. We were working in horrendous conditions, back-breaking work on daily gangs that were selected to repair railroad tracks, to build bunkers and so forth, and to carry cement sacks, 100 pounds on my back-breaking work. A lot of people died. A lot of people died in that camp. It became an epidemics camp. And after a while, slaving in that camp and so many deaths and so many people sick, the Germans realized that they're losing the war because the Allies were advancing very rapidly, and they decided to eliminate all those southern Germany camps, including Kaufering, eliminate them and transport the able-bodied men and women, however many there were, to the northern part of Germany, to Bergen-Belsen, another concentration camp. And we were selected to be transported to this route, to this labor camp. And so we were taken away from the place where we were, and we were forced to march to the train and be boarding the train and going to Bergen-Belsen, ostensibly. These were cattle cars. Men and women both were on that train. It was filled up with prisoners and with soldiers guarding us. The train was going for several hours, and then it stopped in the middle of a forest in Bavaria and didn't go forth and didn't go back. It just stopped right there, cold, with everybody intact. And we were waiting for something to happen. That was in 1945, already spring. On the other side of the track in that forest, a military train came from the other directions and stopped right across from us. That military train was obvious military because all the cannons, the anti-aircraft cannons, were sticking out from it, camouflage. But from the air, suddenly, in the middle of the day, the American planes, attack planes, noticed the military train, and they decided to attack both trains, thinking that both of them are military, not knowing that one is full of prisoners. They came swooping down, a number of them. For the first time I saw a jet in my life. They came roaring towards us, swooping down low and machine gunning everything in sight, including our train with open roofs. There were cattle cars. So many of us died. So many people lost their lives. At that point, I said to my two friends that survived along with me, I said, let's jump that train and save our lives, or else we will be killed if they make another sortie. And so we jumped. And so everybody else that could jumped, and they all of a sudden from the air realized that the striped clothing, the people who were jumping, they had striped clothing, and they realized they made a mistake, that one of the trains was not military, but the damage was done and the mayhem was done. And so we found ourselves in the forest. The locomotives were on fire and the Germans were guarding us. For 3 days we were in that forest. The fourth day, we wake up in the morning and the people, our own people, were yelling to us, the elder ones, hey guys, there are no Germans left. They must have left overnight somewhere. They disappeared. Nobody's around. We're alone. And we were alone in that forest because the Germans left. They knew that the war is coming to an end. So they prepared civilian clothing in their train. They changed overnight, disappeared among the population and left us alone. And after being in the forest for a while, we realized that this cannot go on. So we formed small groups and we set out to the countryside to talk to somebody what to do next. We were bewildered. We didn't even know where we were. And I set out together with my two friends and we came to a farmhouse. The farmhouse, as we came closer, we realized was swarming with military, German military. But it was too late, they noticed us. So they were yelling at us, the patrol, halt, halt, nicht weitergehen. So he comes towards us. He says, don't go any further, stop right there. And so he comes towards us and says, who are you, what are you doing? He said it in German. Wer sind Sie denn? Was machen denn hier? And I was speaking a very good German at that time, so I explained to him what happened. He says, you cannot remain here. This is a military area. Das ist ein militärisches Gebiet. And I says, okay, what do you suggest we do? And he says, I'll take it to my commander. So he took me into the farmhouse, and there I was confronted by the heaviest German I've ever seen in my life, very fat-looking guy with full of stars and stripes, very high-ranking person. And he looks at us very sternly and he says the same thing, who are you or what are you doing here? And I explained to him. He says, you have to turn back where you came from. This is a military area, you cannot be here. So we turned back. And as we go back, about 10, 15 minutes into our walking back, we hear a voice of an older man in German screaming at us, boys, don't go any further, stop, I'm coming to talk to you. So he comes over and he identifies himself as the owner of the farmhouse. And he informs us. He says, this military unit is leaving momentarily. I want you to come with me. I'll take you to my farmhouse. The war is coming to an end. The front is very, very close here. You will stay in my farmhouse for the time being. And I'll take care of you. No one of any German, military or civilian, ever talked to us like that for 6 years. I was totally bewildered, and so were my friends. We went with the farmer. He took us to the barn. We stayed at the farm for several days, milling around. They gave us food and clothing. They treated us like decently. They even had outside showers. By the time we got showered and washed up and got new clothing that they provided for us, we looked at us, we couldn't recognize each other. We were looking all of a sudden like human beings again. I was in the outhouse the third day when I heard tremendous rumblings on the outside, like tractors, like tanks, like I didn't know what it was. And so I was wondering, what am I hearing? Then all of a sudden I heard voices of a language I didn't understand. And so my friends were outside at that time and they saw what was happening. So they were yelling at me, David, come out. We are liberated. The war is at an end. We are liberated. I couldn't wrap it around my head. I didn't understand what it was meaning even was. So I opened the door frankly and frantically, and I'm coming out and I'm seeing a tremendously different sight that I've ever seen. I've seen an armada of men, of soldiers that were not German soldiers, and tanks that didn't look like German tanks, and everything was so different. And I realized these are foreign forces. It was American soldiers liberating that farm. The battalion was American black soldiers liberating that farm. And I never saw a black man in my life before, a live man. In Europe, we didn't see them. They were just not there. And so they're trying frantically to communicate with me and with my friends. And they tried with their hands, with their fingers, with their gesticulations. We couldn't understand what they were saying, and they couldn't understand what we were saying. We were very frustrated. All of a sudden, in the middle of that column comes a very tall, slanky, good-looking, tall, white officer towards us. And he comes straight to us, the three boys. And he says, in unadulterated Yiddish, he says, "Kinder, ihr seid Jiden." And I am just totally beside myself. And I said, "Why, yes, of course we're Jews." And I said to him, "Sir, excuse me, but you're an American officer. How come you speak Yiddish so well?" And he looks at me and he says, "I'm from Brooklyn." I didn't know Brooklyn from Madagascar. I didn't know what he was talking about, but hey, I could communicate with him. And he took us under his wing and he said to us, "I want you to understand that the war is over. America has occupied Germany, and so did Russia and France. Germany capitulated. You are coming with me to a displaced persons camp close by near the city of Landsberg. You will be housed there. You will be given medical attention. You will be treated like human beings. You are free men." And he took us away and he took us to the camp. And that's when we realized that the war is over. Thank you very much for listening.
David, thank you so much for sharing your story with us this afternoon. And I wanted to let you know that you have over 100 people listening to you today. And we have time for questions. So if anybody would like to use the Q&A box to ask some questions, giving you a couple minutes to do that, I wanted to ask if you can please share with the audience if any of your immediate family survived and how you found out.
Okay, so when the war ended in 1945, I was looking frantically in Germany in all the liberated camps for survivors, for anyone that I might recognize or anyone that had even a distant family that possibly survived the war, and I couldn't find anyone. What the survivors did when they were visiting those camps and looking for relatives that may have survived, they left their name on a list so that whoever comes next would see their name and maybe make a connection. And I did leave my name there too, but there were other people that left their names. So there were long lists wherever you went for people that survived the war, identifying themselves who they were and where they can be found. And I couldn't find anyone frantically looking, the breadth and the length of Germany. So I listened to the radio, and the radio announced that Sweden announced that they will take in 200,000 survivors for rehabilitation. They did it as a gesture because they were not in the war, they escaped the war, and so they offered to open their doors. And when I heard that, I said to my two friends that survived with me, I said, "You know, we couldn't find anyone here in Germany, and there are 200,000 people going to be in Sweden. Maybe we can find somebody there." So I went to Sweden with the Swedish Red Cross, and I wound up in Sweden. And in Sweden, I was looking frantically for somebody that may have survived, but there was no one right away that I could find. But I found my future wife there. And so I was alone. I found out subsequent, much later, that my father was alive. I had no idea. But I found this out through a third person that I didn't even know. But that is a very story, it's a story by itself, really, to be told. But I found my father after the war. He survived the war with me. Out of 100 people, only the 2 of us survived the war. 98 members of my family perished in the Holocaust.
Thank you so much for sharing. What is the most important lesson about humanity that you learned from this experience?
What I have learned firsthand on my own skin is that human beings are capable of so much evil. They are also capable of so much good, depending on the circumstances. But under gruesome circumstances, where someone has all the power and uses that power for nefarious reasons, human beings can be put in a position to be dehumanized. That's what we experienced during the war. Bereft of any feelings of humanity. We were a shell of our former self. We hated ours being the way we were, but we were thrown into this situation. And this can happen, and this can happen again. That is the frightful thing to think about. Under given circumstances, this can happen again. Because no one in their right mind thought that what happened in Europe during Hitler can possibly take place. It was unprecedented. It was unprecedented in history. It was horrendous to contemplate even, but it did happen. And I am the eyewitness. So human beings are capable of doing that. And this is what I have learned. I've also learned that persistence and resilience and hope and looking at life with the glass half full rather than half empty takes you a long way into realizing that life has many sides to it. And one of them is called hope. And that hope is so precious, you have to hold on to it under any circumstances and work towards it to make it a reality and to not cave in to despair. This is what the survivors essentially learned. That is why we were able to come out of this hellhole of this Holocaust and rise from the ashes, as it were, dust ourselves off and go on with our lives and make something meaningful out of it. And so many of us did. And I'm proud of that.
Thank you so much for those reflections. What languages do you speak?
I speak 5 languages. I speak Yiddish, I speak German, I speak Swedish, I speak English, and I speak Polish.
Thank you. Do you remember what thoughts you had when you were liberated? Do you remember if there was a feeling of fear or peace or survivor's guilt?
There was actually many conflicting feelings that we all felt. Guilt was definitely one of them. Guilt, not because we did anything wrong, but guilt having the feeling that why me? Why did I deserve to survive and not my mom and dad? Why did I deserve to survive that my younger brother that was 10 years old deserved to die and I did not? What makes me so special? I had feeling of guilt that I survived and they didn't. And a lot of survivors have that feeling. This was one of the feelings. The other feeling that we had was the feeling that, will the world listen to what we have to tell them what just happened? Will we have the ear of anyone that did not go through what we went through to give us some understanding? These were questions in our mind. We weren't sure that the world was ready to listen to us. And the fact was that when we were liberated and we became normal again, as it were, and start mingling with those in these countries that did not go through the Holocaust, the world was not willing or able to listen to us. It was too horrendous for them to listen to. It was not too horrendous for us to go through it, but it was too painful for them to listen to. So they shut us up. And when I started to tell them, even in the mildest way of what happened, they said, oh, don't talk about it. No, this is too hard to listen to. Don't talk about it. The world was not ready. It took me 20 long years to finally open up and to tell my story. And I firstly told it to my children, of course. I wanted them to know what happened, and they do. But I was also trying to tell the wider world what happened. Because unless you know how to guard yourself against evil, unless you know and you use history as a precedent, as a guidepost for the future, unless you know, you are running the risk of repeating the same horror again and again. Because history does repeat itself if we let it.
Thank you so much. Can you please remind the audience how old you were when this started and how old you were when you were liberated? And at that age, if you remember this very vividly, and if there's other aspects of this time period that you don't remember as much?
Okay, when the war started, and I was in that streetcar when I saw the attack, and that was the beginning of World War II, I was 11 years old. I just finished the 5th grade. I was a very good student, and I understood quite a bit, actually. What I understood is that prior to the outbreak of World War II, there was a lot of reverberations and rumblings all across Europe, especially in the Jewish communities of Europe. Because Hitler, once he came to power, he started to implement his Mein Kampf edicts against the Jewish people. He made no secret about it. The world knew, because he openly started to implement it by creating the Holocaust, by creating first the Kristallnacht in 1938. He let loose his Nazi goons to break all the windows in Germany of Jewish merchants, of Jewish stores, put fire to synagogues, deport the Jews from their homes forcibly, put them in concentration camps. He started the Holocaust in 1938 in earnest for the whole world to see. I wanted to see the reaction of the world when they look at it, and what are they going to do about it. And the sad fact is that the world looked at it and did absolutely nothing. They let it happen. They let it happen, including the Vatican in the room, including Pope Pius XII, the moral authority of the Catholic world. They let it happen. Hitler felt that he had the green light, and so he went ahead with the Holocaust. And the Holocaust, my friends, started with the Kristallnacht. That was the absolute beginning of the Holocaust. And when that happened, reverberations across the Jewish communities of all of Europe, the rest of Europe, started to come in news about what was going on. And people were talking about it loud in gatherings, between family members, at dinner tables, everyone. It was, the atmosphere was so thick with foreboding. You could cut it with a knife. I could hear all this. I could be subject to all this. I lived in this atmosphere. So by the time the war broke out, it was almost like expected to happen, but not the way it happened. We didn't know it's going to be an undeclared blitzkrieg. And this is what I saw when I was 11 years old. By the time I was 17 and the war ended, I went through 6 years of living hell. I became street smart at a very early age. I knew how to hold my tongue and not to talk. I knew that your life and your death hangs in your tongue. That's what my grandmother always used to tell me. It is what you say that can put you in trouble. It is what you keep quiet that may save you. I learned all these things. I learned also survival skills. And by the time I was 17, I may have been only 17 in years, but folks, having gone through this crucible, I had the mind and the experience of a 65-year-old man. I was wise, too wise for my own age. That's how much I've learned. That's how much I've seen. And I think that most of the survivors today will tell you the same thing. That's an experience that I wish on nobody. If you have to grow up to learn the hard way, that way, no thank you. But this is what we had to do. And that's where we are today.
Thank you so much for sharing. This is a more personal question, so feel free if you don't need to answer in depth if you don't want to, but how did this experience shape your relationship with Judaism? And did you ever reflect on that throughout the years after the war?
You know, this is a question that was asked of me many, many times. And at first I was having a very difficult time answering this because there was a lot of ambivalency within me. When I realized in the ghetto what is going on, and I witnessed it on my own skin, frankly, I lost my faith in God because I always was taught that God is omnipotent, that God is everywhere, that God makes everybody do whatever they do, that God decides the fate of the people, that God intervenes in the fate of the people, that in God we have to trust. God is good, He's merciful. And we didn't see any mercy coming from any quarter, not even from God. To us, God was looking on the horror that was created in front of Him and turned His eyes away. How could I go on believing that there is a God? But I was brought up in Judaism with so deep roots, going back generations. I loved being Jewish. I loved the values that Jewish people had. I loved to share in those values. I loved to be part of that society. I loved the closeness and the beliefs and the goodness in people's hearts and the belief in charity and the belief of having pity on the stranger and the belief that the world is not an evil place, but can be a very good place if we contribute towards it. I love those beliefs. I wanted to be part of it. So I did not lose faith in Judaism's beliefs, but I lost faith in the divinity of God for a long time. And in this despair, in this agony, by the time I was like 16 years old, I suddenly was inspired to write down in words what I am experiencing, what I'm seeing. And I wrote a poem. And it is in my book that I wrote. I wrote a poem explaining exactly what I am seeing, what is happening around me. And I translated that poem later in English for a wider audience to be able to read it and understand it. But that poem spoke from my soul. It spoke the pain that I experienced and what I've seen around me. And that remains a testimony to the horror and to the dark era of the Holocaust and of the ghetto.
Thank you so much for sharing this. Do you remember seeing any Jehovah's Witnesses in the camps?
As a matter of fact, I did, but in the camps, they were very circumspect. They did not want to be identified as Jehovah's Witnesses, even though they were thrown into the camps because of it. Hitler didn't tolerate anyone deviating from the Nazi line of belief. And so he threw in any opponent, anyone that was thinking differently, into concentration camps. But the Jews were thrown in there for very different reasons, only because they were Jews, not because they held different opinions, but because they were Jews, period. But all the others that were persecuted because they were, in the essence, by Nazism, they were considered inferior, subhuman, Untermenschen, okay? There were also real Germans in concentration camp, real, actually born Germans, Christian Germans. But their grandfather was traced to be having been a Jew. So that tainted them enough for the Nazis to throw them in the concentration camp. And you know, the German pastor, Martin Niemöller, he was a very known personality in Germany. He was a Lutheran pastor. He disagreed with Hitler. They threw him in concentration camp. He survived the war. And he famously said in his book, when he wrote about his experiences, and he illustrated how dangerous it is for humanity to become indifferent, apathetic. That invites danger. And he said it famously. When they first came for the labor unionists, I didn't say anything because I was not a labor unionist. When they came for the gypsies and the disabled, I didn't say anything because I was not one of them. And when they came for the Jews, I didn't say anything. I was not Jewish. But then they came for me, and there was no one else left to speak for me. What this illustrates today, even in our own society, in our own day, what that illustrates is that apathy and indifference breeds evil. You must never become apathetic in the face of evil. Never, ever. Because it's dangerous. It may start with a certain segment of society being persecuted. It never ends there. It is like a deadly virus spreading throughout society, throughout the world. It affects everybody in the end, one way or the other. And this is my message. This is what Niemöller's message was. This is what we understand and know. And that is what I'm preaching to the young people today. Please do not remain apathetic and indifferent to the evil that you see coming. Stand up, speak up, loud and clear. Fight against it. Don't let it take root, because it's going to kill you in the end. This is the message that I cannot emphasize enough for all the people that are listening. We need to be free people. We need to understand that we have a right in this world to sit and to be here, to live here, and so does everybody else. on this planet. Nobody should be feeling inferior to the next person. This is what we are fighting for. This is our belief. This is what Holocaust taught us. And we need to remember that, ever, forever.
Thank you for sharing. Some of our audience members are interested in learning how you came to the United States and when.
Okay, I can tell you that very easily. I was living in Sweden for 10 years after the war. I found my wife there. She was a wonderful young woman, also a survivor from Czechoslovakia. We found each other, but we were very, very much alone. I had the feeling that no one from my family ever survived. This is before I knew that my dad did. And she felt the same way, that none of her family survived. She didn't know that some of her siblings did survive, actually. And so we decided to get married after 3 weeks courtship. And that marriage lasted for 55 years, believe it or not. And so I lived in Sweden for 10 years. And after 10 years, in the 50s, in 1953, 52, 53, the Korean War was raging. And great fears arose in Europe, especially among the survival community, that Russia may invade Europe, because it was not a fight between America and Russia. It was a fight between communism and capitalism. It was an ideological fight. And we felt threatened in Sweden that Russia, being next door, literally, within minutes by jet, they could be in Sweden at any time they choose. And we did not want to be caught in that vice. We just came out from the brown hell of Hitler. We did not want to get back into the red head of Stalin. And so I said to my wife, we need to get the hell out of Europe. I don't want to be in this godforsaken, cursed place anymore. Let's get out as far as we can go. Let's go to America. And we applied, and I was lucky enough that my wife's Czechoslovakian visa was free enough that we could get the visas very quickly. Within 3 months, we got the visas to go to the United States. We came in May, I believe the 5th, in 1954, to the United States. And we settled here, first in Pittsburgh. We lived for 12 years. We did well there. And then we came to settle to the Los Angeles area. And that's where we remained ever since 1966. And our life in America was good, very good, actually. I became pretty well to do in terms of being able to spread my wings with my abilities. I became a designer. I was working for the movie industry. I was creating wonderful fashions for 15 years. I got to know who was who in Hollywood. I really thrived very well. And then I got burned out and switched over to real estate, and I became successful there. And so all in all, I retired at an early age, and my children grew up and formed families. And I am now a proud father of 3 wonderful daughters and 3 son-in-laws, but also 7 grandchildren and 7 great-grandchildren. And that is the reward for my efforts. And that is the fruit of what you sow is what you reap, as they say. I tried my best. My wife did too. And we are really honored to see our family as wonderful as they are and thriving in the United States.
Thank you so much for sharing. At what point Did you share these experiences with your own family, with your children and grandchildren? And do you think it helped you heal emotionally?
Yes, as I said before, it took me 20 years to open up. But when I finally did, my first efforts and my wife's were to give testimony to the Spielberg Foundation, and we gave a full testimony, which is on file, my wife and I. And that is when we really opened up about our experiences and told them what happened in that tape. Secondly, my children were reaching the age where they were old enough to speak to them about it and to let them know what their parents went through. And they were, of course, very receptive to listen. They also were burdened by it, as children would. So we had to gear our tale, our story to my children in accordance with the age in which they were in. But over the years, I was speaking to their schools. I was speaking to many organizations. They were listening into it. They're very knowledgeable about the Holocaust because they were joining me in the March of the Living later on as adults, and the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I was there with my middle daughter. My children are very aware of the Holocaust. My oldest daughter went with my wife back to her city of Jasina in Czechoslovakia, where she was born. On the way, they stopped in Auschwitz and they visited the crematoria there and all the museums that were available to see. And so all my three children were immersed in the knowledge of the Holocaust. And of course, my grandchildren as well, because over time, as I said, I was speaking about it widely to all of their schools that they attended. And so they all know and feel and know about the Holocaust and were affected by it till the very day.
Thank you for sharing. You mentioned that you found out that your father survived. When were you able to see him again for the first time?
You know, after the war, the times were very chaotic. The survivors were left bereft of anything. They all had whatever shirt they had on their back, that's it. So wherever they found themselves, they had no means of having enough means to travel, for instance. So once I found out that my father was alive, he happened to be at that time in Poland, and I happened to be in Sweden. And the only way we could correspond is by mail, actually. I was writing handwritten letters to him, and he wrote handwritten letters to me. We wrote to each other in Yiddish because that was the language that we were most comfortable with. And we told each other about ourselves, but he was trying to reestablish his life in Poland because he went back to see if he can find anyone there. And the only person that he found was a cousin of mine that survived the war, a female cousin, and she was the only one. And the reason she survived the war is because she was in Russia. She escaped Hitler in the last minute. Her family did not survive. So my father tried to reestablish his factory in the city of Strykow, and when the Poles, the Christian Poles, found out that the Jew came back and tried to become a merchant again, and tried to reestablish himself, they came in the middle of the night with revolvers to his head, with guns to his head, and told him, "You goddamn Jew, if you don't get out of Poland, not just of the city, but of Poland, by tomorrow, we come back and we kill you." Just like that. That was a threat that my father took very seriously because he knew that they meant what they were saying. They chased him literally out of Poland after the war, right after the war. And so my father ran for his life. He first wound up in Vienna, and then from Vienna he went into Germany again for just a little respite, stayed there for a little while, and then in 1948, as soon as Israel became independent, he decided to go to Israel and settle for good. He says, I want to be out of this godforsaken, cursed Europe. I don't want to deal with anti-Semites anymore that threaten my life. I want to be in my own country where I can feel safe. And he wound up in Israel. He settled there and he lived out his life there till he died at the age of almost 90. Oh yeah, I didn't see him for 12 years actually, because when he was in Israel, we corresponded, but we had no means of seeing each other. He didn't have enough means to travel. He would refuse to travel by air. He was scared, he told me. So I had to work on 3 jobs in Sweden to put together enough money for a ticket on a ship for him to be able to come and see us in Sweden. So in 1953, 1 year before I came to the United States, he came for the first time since 1942. So many years passed by during that time, and so much has happened. So for the first time after 12 years, he came to Sweden on a boat to visit us in Helsingborg, Sweden, where we lived. I had already a wife with 2 children. My oldest daughter, Helene, was 7 years old, and my younger one at that time was 5 years old. And so these 2 little girls never saw their grandpa before, and they were very much full of anticipation because I told them he's coming to see us. My wife never met her father-in-law either. So when he came down from the ship and we were waiting, that was at night, rather late in the evening, we were waiting there and I saw his silhouette on top there, coming down the stairs. And I said to my wife, that's my dad. That's my dad. I know. I just know his silhouette. And he came down, and when he confronted us, he could not talk. He was completely knotted up inside. In Yiddish, we call it verklemmt. He was totally verklemmt. He was so knotted up, he couldn't bring out a word, but his eyes were flooding with tears. And so was mine. We embraced, we held a long time. We didn't say a word. We went to the taxi to go home from the harbor, and to the entire ride, we still didn't say one word, but he was crying constantly and squeezing my hand. And then the minute I opened up the door to my apartment, he became talkative, thank God. And then everything came flooding out. It was an incredible time that I will never forget. It was a meeting that is indescribable between father and son. And ever since, we were so close. We were so close, even though we were a world apart. I was in America, he was in Israel. I came to visit my dad 40 times. I went to Israel to be with my dad and visit him and stay with him till his very long old age. Yes, I'm proud of that.
Thank you so much for sharing that beautiful story. I wanted to quickly share with the audience some of your photos.
This is my paternal family. This is my father right here.
Which is this your father?
Next to my grandma, yes. That's my dad, 6 years old. And these are all his siblings. And this is the oldest sister, Eva. She wound up marrying a Jewish Russian lieutenant during World War I, and they came to live in Odessa, the Soviet Union, and I never ever saw her again. Neither did anyone in my family. She was just completely alone there in Odessa with her family. It could not communicate with us because of communism. They wouldn't let anyone communicate with the West. So I never really got to know my sister. This is my mother's family. This is at the time when there was an unveiling of my grandmother's brother. And here is my mom, and here's my dad, and here's my mom's sister, Hella. Here's her husband. Here's my grandma, Hinda. And here's my aunts, my 2 aunts, Luba and Bina. And these were the people from my mother's side and from my father's side, my family, almost 100 strong. They all lost their lives, save for me and my dad. 98 people out of 100 perished in the Holocaust. That's what Hitler did. That's what Hitler did. That is the admission to the concentration camp of Dachau, the document that Michael Morgenstern recovered for me, showing that very valuable document of that very dark time for me being in Dachau. It was horrendous. And these are memories that I can never forget for as long as I live, obviously. And I'm trying to tell people of what happens to decent people, where indecent people having the sway. When evil takes root, when nefarious plans are being allowed to materialize. And that only happens because of our silence, of our deafening silence when we see things happen and we turn a blind eye. We must not ever let this happen again. Never forget the Holocaust. Never forget its lessons, because it affects humanity, not just the Jews. All of humanity is affected when evil has its sway. That's when I got married with my beautiful wife, Charlotte, in 1945. Yeah, I was about 19 years old. That's me, my dad, in Nahariya, Israel. When I visited him, he was already aging. I was 60 and he was 88 at that time. Yeah. So I live with memories. I am 94 years old now. I have a lot of memories. Many of them, I must tell you, are very good ones because they happened after the war, and the good ones before the war when I was a kid. I had wonderful childhood memories, and I have wonderful memories after the Holocaust because I created those memories, myself and my wife. We were making every effort at living a normal life after this Holocaust. It wasn't easy. It never was. But we were persistent, we were resilient, we were determined, and we made it happen. And I think that younger people should take this as a living example, that despair should not be the last word. Despair should not be the last avenue. You know, there is a partisan song in Yiddish that says, "Zug nicht keinmal als der Geist am letzten Weg." Don't you ever say that this is the end of the line. It isn't. Life has hope, and hope gives life. These are very important things to remember and to hold on to. I'm trying to impart this in everyone that will listen to me. And maybe that is why I've reached my ripe old age so far.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us. And I think you just gave a very strong conclusion. And I think this is a perfect way for everyone to remember your story today. I was actually just thinking if you would be able to share with us one memory of your parents and brother, a pleasant memory that you have of your family before this started.
Yes, absolutely. I remember this particular one time. I was about 10 years old, where for the first time ever, my father said to me, "Dufchela," he says to me, "how would you like to go to a Yiddish theater?" And I have never been to a live Jewish theater before. I was only 10 years old. They were playing adult plays, obviously. One of the plays that they were playing was the Pintele Yid, the little dot that is a Jew. It was a very important play. It was an adult play, that with adult issues. It dealt with Jewish existence. It dealt with the different aspects of Jewish existence in Poland. I didn't understand everything, but the depiction, the costumes, the diction, the songs, everything that came with it were so remaining in my mind so vividly. That was like an incredible highlight of my life as a 10-year-old. I remember it till the very day. I was so honored when my father invited me to go to the theater. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, not just with us today, but for all the times over the years that you have done this for our community, because by doing this and by sharing these messages with not only students, any audience, you make sure on such a regular basis that the world will be a better place, and you do everything in your power to help us fulfill our mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. I wish I had time to read all of the hundreds of comments that we've gotten during your talk, but one of our viewers says, "Your humanity today, demonstrated by your strength and generosity in telling this story, is an inspiration to us about how humanity can recover from even the depth of your experiences." And also, you have friends and family watching today as well. And we just thank you so much on behalf of the museum and our whole community for everything that you do to make this world a better place.
Okay, in conclusion, I want to say that I am deeply grateful to the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles, equally deeply grateful to the Museum of Tolerance, where I'm also a speaker, because these are the venues that I'm using a lot to bring my message to the world, and they are enabling me to do this. And for this, I'm very, very grateful. I'm also grateful to all the listeners that have been listening, and hopefully, my message has remained a very vital part of their thinking and of their feelings, and what they will take with them is a lesson in history that they will be able to draw on. And I thank you very much again to everybody that participated in this program. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your attention and questions. We hope to welcome everyone to the museum in person at some point in the near future. You can visit our website, and also our programs are still mostly virtual, and we have Holocaust survivor talks every Thursday at 11 o'clock. David, thank you so much. Seid gesund und a scheinem Dank.
Thank you very much. A scheinem Dank bei dir auch. Thank you very much.
So much. Wishing everybody a happy, healthy, and safe weekend. And I know you will all keep David's story in mind today when you hear about Holocaust Remembrance Day and for the rest of your lives as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.